years following World War II, Southwest Louisiana would rapidly transition from a relatively isolated and underdeveloped region into an important center for the oil and natural gas industries, with its first refinery being built just outside of the city of Lake Charles in 1944. Over the next 3 decades, the lake area would become an important link in a vital refinery chain that stretches across the Gulf Coast, with about a quarter of the regional and state economy dependent on the oil and natural gas trade. It was during the first 2 decades of post-war America that would see cheap and affordable electricity finally become widely accessible to the more rural, rough and tumble parts of the southwestern corner of our stretch of Louisiana. By the start of the 1960s, nearly every home had electricity, running water, and indoor plumbing, and the region would see itself emerge as a vital hub in everything from chemical and plastics manufacturing to shipping and the budding international trade system. With the passage of the Federal Highway Act in mid-1956, work began on the construction of Interstate 10 in the early months of 1957. Following roughly the same route as the Spanish Trail Gulf Coast Highway, built 3.5 decades before, I-10 was sliced through the lower half of southwest Louisiana, through Calcasieu and Jeff Davis parishes, with 171 expanded into a federal highway and designated as the main evacuation route for the coastal area of the region, and partially serves as the primary link in western Louisiana between I-10 and I-49. 171 had originally been built in the late 1920s as a 2-lane gravel road tying Manny to Lake Charles, and was extended into the northwestern parishes to Shreveport throughout the 1930s. Eventually, I-10 would link the Pacific coast to the Atlantic and stretch for over 2,460 miles from Santa Monica, California to Jacksonville, Florida. This nationwide infrastructure expansion was a pet project of President Eisenhower, who had served as the Supreme Commander of Allied forces in the European theater during World War II, and knew firsthand the importance of an integrated federal road network during national emergencies and more localized natural disasters. The project would be declared officially finished in late 1970, with work continuing into the present day as extra lanes and other improvements have been made in the decades since. Since as far back as anyone can remember, the Cajun Riviera has been a prime local attraction for folks across southwest Louisiana and the surrounding area. Situated in Cameron Parish, around the area of Holly Beach, it is home to a series of elevated beach houses built high on piers along the low-lying beach. Due to the threats of storm surges during tropical storms and hurricanes that can inundate the beachfront with water pushed in from the Gulf. First appearing on official state maps in 1948, Holly Beach grew into a prime getaway spot for locals and out-of-towners alike, who were drawn to its distinct and original Cajun Zydeco roots and laid-back beach-going atmosphere. With this history and culture deeply rooted in the Gulf of Mexico, southwest Louisiana has always been at the mercy of the very erratic climate patterns that are common to this part of the country. Grinding through the deep waters some distance offshore lurks the Gulf Stream current that swirls up from the Caribbean Sea to the lower reaches of the Gulf, then twists through the Florida Straits, giving southern Florida its familiar tropical climate year-round, and along the eastern seaboard of the Atlantic coast, as far up as New England and Newfoundland, before spinning off towards the British Isles and the European mainland, which, along with the hot, dry air of the Sahara winds blowing in from North Africa, gives northern and central Europe its distinctive and relatively mild winter months, warming the continent by as much as 15 to 20 degrees, and keeps the northern parts of the North Sea and Baltic free of ice during the cold season. It is said that without the warming effect of the Gulf Stream, northern Europe would have a climate roughly similar to the west coast of Alaska and central Canada. The existence of the Gulf Stream has been known as far back as the first arrival of Spanish and Portuguese explorers to the New World at the outset of the Age of Discovery in the early 1500s, and was ultimately mapped by Benjamin Franklin, based on reports from sailors and sea merchantmen navigating the Atlantic, and his own observations of tides and currents along the coastline of colonial America. The Gulf Stream helps contribute to the higher than normal temperatures of the Gulf of Mexico, which makes violent and powerful hurricanes and tropical storms a good deal more frequent across the Gulf Coast region. Set on the western section of the Gulf of Mexico, southwest Louisiana's climate is a volatile mix of warm Gulf air pushing up from the moist tropical heat of the Caribbean, colliding with the colder, drier air of the upper regions of the North American continent that tends to produce very violent and unpredictable weather. This, along with the warm waters of the Gulf, tends to result in powerful storms and hurricanes that ordinarily form off the coast of Africa or in the central Atlantic. In the early hours of June 27, 1957, one such hurricane rolled ashore near the mouth of the Sabine River, between Louisiana and Texas, that would be remembered by old-timers and anyone alive at the time as the worst storm southwest Louisiana had ever experienced up to that point. Audrey had formed from a tropical disturbance in the outer Caribbean on June 24th, and rapidly built into the most powerful June storm ever recorded in the Atlantic Basin, reaching its maximum sustained winds in excess of 125 miles per hour. For 3 long days, this monster storm roared across the Gulf of Mexico, forcing the evacuation of oil platforms and disturbing the offshore oil industry and the American energy sector as a whole, which is said to have contributed to a minor recession that affected the nation in the last months of 1957 and into the first half of 1958. At around 7 a.m. Central Standard Time, Audrey made landfall as a Category 3 hurricane between Johnson Bayou and Sabine Pass, completely devastating the Gulf Coast area where it impacted, and wiped out 90% of the population of Cameron Parish, which had gone to sleep confused by conflicting statements from local, state, and federal authorities on how serious the storm was to the region. Many local and some state officials were concerned about the economic fallout from mass evacuations of the area in the direct impact zone, and had made reassuring statements to calm the people into staying where they were and not to panic. Audrey would tear through the western section of Cameron Parish, sending a 6-foot-high wall of water all the way up into the city of Lake Charles in central Calcasieu Parish, and would spawn dozens of tornadoes as it pushed across the middle and northern reaches of southwest Louisiana and across the northwestern portion of the state. The remnants of Audrey would cut across the Tennessee Valley and up into New England and the maritime provinces of Canada along its Atlantic coast. When all was said and done, Audrey would kill approximately 420 people in total and cause around $150 million in damages, a sum of around $138 billion in our own time. The vast majority of the victims of the storm were in Cameron Parish, where around 320 people were killed by the initial impact of the hurricane, leaving the Cajun Riviera a devastated wasteland of destroyed homes and buildings, and lives cut short by this heartbreaking tragedy. It is said that mass graves were dug in many areas, and the remains of the victims were buried alongside the remains of the exhumed graves that had been uprooted by the force of the storm surge that had swept over the region. adding a chilling twist to the many grim horror stories told by the few who had managed to survive the storm and had lived to tell about it for the rest of their lives. To this day, the shadow of Hurricane Audrey looms large, and the memories of those who lived through the sheer carnage and destruction she left behind across the southwestern corner of Louisiana, that left a generation of folks across our region permanently scarred by the awesome power of Mother Nature and the pain and devastation she can bring in the blink of an eye when we least expect. Today, Cameron Parish is home to some of the most beautiful natural wetlands on the planet, and is well known for its diverse wildlife and intercoastal and offshore commercial and pleasure fishing, which contributes a good deal to the local economy of the parish, along with ranching and other agricultural-related enterprises. Shrimping, crabbing, and fresh and saltwater fishing are common industries in this part of Louisiana, and its world-renowned crawfish is harvested, packaged, and sold across the country and around the globe. Over the last few decades, Cameron Parish, like the rest of coastal Louisiana, has had to contend with coastal erosion and other issues related to the encroachment of the Gulf, and various cost-effective schemes have been devised to combat this threat, including using discarded Christmas trees and felled tree limbs to create artificial barriers offshore to slow the rip currents of the Gulf that eat away at the shallow shoreline. Another problem Cameron Parish has faced over the years is the intrusion of saltwater into its pristine wetlands, which threatens the wildlife that inhabits these fragile and vulnerable areas. Cameron was formed a few years after the end of the Civil War during the Reconstruction period to serve as a majority black parish and a refuge for freed slaves across the southwestern edges of the Gulf Coast of Louisiana. But the majority of the local black population eventually left to escape the violence and persecution during the dark days of the Jim Crow South. A small but aging minority of the parish still speaks Cajun French as a first language, and the locals have a long and proud history of surviving hard times and adversity, and cherish their legendary traditions and simple but unique way of life. Cameron is the largest parish in Louisiana, with a total land area nearly as large as the state of Vermont, and sits just 2 to 3 feet above sea level at most points, and has a combined population of no more than 2,900 people, ranking behind only Tensas Parish as the least populated of the 64 parishes in Louisiana. Cameron and parts of Calcasieu is said to be the westernmost point of Acadiana. Zydeco music and gumbo hold a special place in the local traditions and folklore of the parish, tucked away on the western edge of the Bayou State, where pelicans and alligators are as much a part of the local scenery as sunshine and thunderstorms, and can be seen all along the highways and back roads throughout the marshes and swamps that make Cameron Parish a land of endless wonder and adventure in the sun, quietly gleaming like a jewel in the sand between the wildflowers and the thickets on the southern tip of this forgotten corner of our rugged Louisiana paradise.